Welcome to another episode of Clean Water Champions. Today we're going on a field trip to a pioneer prairie cemetery. It's one of the few places that you can find original prairie habitat. Our guide is Benda, known as the Illinois Botanizer. What can we learn from these historic landscapes to help us restore the landscape for cleaner water?
So before the arrival of Europeans, basically the entire state of Illinois and beyond was one giant natural area. It was in a pristine natural condition, and it was maintained in this condition by the natives, the indigenous people that were in this area. They knew the regenerative power of wildfire, and so they would burn the prairie periodically, and that would return nutrients to the soil, and it would reduce competition, and it would stimulate growth. And this growth of grasses and other plants is what the bison depended on for their survival. And of course, that's what the natives depended on for their survival, on the bison. So they maintained this landscape, and when the Europeans arrived, they farmed and cultivated these areas and really began a drastic transformation of the landscape. And that is one reason why the prairie is quite rare. But in Illinois, it's wet here. And so the wetness and the moisture allows for us to have a fuller prairie, including the tall grasses. Now, another thing that's important to consider about plants in the prairie is they're storing carbon. So we have a lot of biomass underground in the soil that's all sequestering carbon instead of releasing it into the atmosphere, which is one thing that contributes to the global warming. Originally, there were 22 million acres of prairie in Illinois, and there's very little left. A few hundred acres really statewide of high quality prairie. We've converted almost the entire prairie landscape to agriculture. And in the 1960s and 70s, when a lot of the prairie had been converted, enthusiasts and biologists wanted to figure out, where does the high quality prairie remain in the state? And they found that in old pioneer cemeteries, areas that were set aside in the late 1870s, existed native high quality prairie. So these areas are small. This site here is about 5 acres in size. And that's decent size for a prairie remnant of what's left in Illinois. But of course, from 22 million acres, that's not very much. So one thing that makes this site extremely special is that this ground has never been plowed. And of course, it's never been plowed because people are buried here, and it was set aside so long ago that the original vegetation still persists to this day. So what really makes a prairie high quality? And it has to do with the vegetation. So we can say that not all plants are created equal, in that there are some plants that are relegated to pristine, untouched areas, and then other plants that are more widespread on the environment. So these plants that occur here, often many of the species are what we call conservative plants. They're picky about where they grow, and they're not found out in the wider landscape. And so they're growing together here in assemblage that has been created, and evolved together over thousands of years. So we can look at the diversity of species. There's about, typically high quality prairie has more than 100 different types of plants in them. Here we have common milkweed, which is Asclepias syriaca. And I think most people now are aware of the importance of milkweed, that they are the host plant for the monarch butterfly. And it's also useful to consider that there are a lot of insects that are dependent on different plants here in the prairie, not just monarchs. For example, we have the Carner blue butterfly, which likes wild lupin, and there's just a lot of examples of interactions like that. But of course, the monarch gets a lot of the attention. It is such a beautiful butterfly. And in Illinois, we actually have 19 species of milkweed across the state. Some of them are quite rare. This one here, the common milkweed, as the name implies, is a very common species. And one of the things that you can use to easily identify common milkweed is that the follicles here, which are the seed pods, they have a lot of bumpy protrusions on them. That's the only milkweed in Illinois that has that. All the other milkweed pods, they're going to be smooth on the exterior. Here's another iconic prairie plant called compass plant, Silphium liciniatum. And liciniatum refers to liciniate, which means cut-leaved or finely divided. And we can see here in this leaf that it is finely divided into many different divisions. Also, the leaves are very rough. That's something that's useful. Always want to touch plants. I know there are some plants like poison ivy that can cause a rash, but there's really a pretty limited number that you don't want to touch, and you can get so much out of just feeling the plant. In fact, if you hand a botanist a leaf and say, "What is this plant?" the first thing they're going to do is touch it. There's so much you can gather from that. So don't be afraid to touch plants. Also, this is called compass plant because the flower stalks, they're really tall. They're about 6 feet or even 8 feet tall, and the flowers are supposed to turn and orient with the sun. Hence, that's why it gets the name compass plant. But it is a composite in the sunflower family. Of course, the composites have a combination of ray and disc flowers, which are both present on this particular wildflower. Here's a plant species I bet most people have heard of, and it's called the field thistle, Cerseum discolor. And of course, thistles often sort of get a bad reputation as people don't want them in their lawns, but they are native, most are native to Illinois. And in fact, we do have several rare species like the pitcher's thistle or Hill's thistle. This is a common field thistle. And the leaves, they're hard to see this time of year, but they're green above and white below. And so the joke there with the name Cerseum discolor is you say, well, is it discolor or dat color? Of course, another joke with this plant is they say, beware of thistle, because thistle get ya. Of course, it has the spiny parts of the plant that are often unpleasant to touch, but this is a very useful plant. Goldfinches love thistle. Lots of birds, will eat the seeds off of there. So this is definitely a plant that is helpful to have in the landscape here. Many species of thistle out in the prairie. So there's lots of things you can do to help natural land in your area. There are in fact 29 of these high quality pioneer cemetery prairies in Illinois. So you might want to find one near you, see who's managing that property and help them. Also consider contacting your local IDNR office, the Department of Natural Resources, and talk to the heritage biologist or the University of Illinois Extension System and find out what volunteer opportunities are available in your area. Another beneficial feature of the prairie ground relates to soil erosion. So with lots of those prairie roots underground, they're holding that soil together, and they're holding it together with water in between as well. So when water falls onto the land, it soaks into the earth and it's stored there and it's released very slowly. Versus in the surrounding farmland, when water falls on that soil, it washes away very quickly and it takes that valuable topsoil with it and it carries it into the Mississippi River and all the way down to Louisiana. So lastly, I'd like to challenge you to start to look at plants in the environment and look for native plants and see if there are some that you can incorporate in your home landscape.
As Chris was just saying, you could look at a map, go online, find some original prairie or forest or virgin habitat in your neighborhood. Study those original habitats to help learn about restoring habitats. Maybe you can become a guardian of those habitats. Maybe from your own field ecology, looking at the plants and animals and the relationships, you could restore some of that habitat in your yard. Maybe you could plant prairie and see what kinds of butterflies and birds show up in your neighborhood. Work with your friends. See if you can restore some of that original prairie to your native landscape.